Yo, what's up guys, hope you guys are doing good. So today we are going to see what if Ino liked Naruto from childhood part 1. Hope you will enjoy this video, so before we start please like the video and subscribe to our channel and hit bell notification, it motivates me to upload more fanfics for my lovely audience. So let's get started. Uzumaki Naruto, called the instructor's voice. Out of the long string of 11 and 12-year-olds stepped one blonde, the smallest, and the only one wearing bright orange. He walked in a straight line along the sun-baked dirt that made up the training field to the place marked with an X in front of the instructor, who happened to be Iruka. Please Naruto, thought Iruka, please pass this time, for both our sakes. Naruto, said Iruka, I want you to try and transform into the Hokage. Naruto looked around, from Iruka, to the academy building behind Iruka, to the strange ninja standing off by the schoolyard gate wearing half a mask and a cockeye forehead protector, and breathed a small sigh. Why does there have to be an audience for this? Naruto wondered, looking beyond the silver-haired ninja to the second man standing farther back. This more concealed character wore clothes stranger than the first, a jet-black cloak that hid him from shoulder to toe, and a swirled orange mask with an opening for only one eye. Despite the fact that he and Iruka had been practicing this transformation for days on end, Naruto still couldn't quite get it right. Something always seemed to go wrong, but nevertheless he formed the familiar seal of the ram and shouted, Henge. There was a loud poof, and a puff of smoke, which the wind blew away, revealing an almost exact copy Sarutobi. Almost. The spiky blonde hair that erupted where the Hokage's hat should have been ruined the effect and brought uproarious laughter from the crowd of children. Iruka sighed and put his fingers on his nose, rubbing slightly at the scar. Naruto. The boy released the jutsu and stepped back, begging Iruka for one more chance. Please Iruka-sensei, Naruto said, putting his hands together and staring at Iruka with watering eyes. This was his fourth time failing, and one more letdown would be more than he could handle. Please, I know I can do it this time. Naruto, you know I see. Please give him another chance, Iruka-sensei, called a voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to look at the source, Yamanaka Ino, who quickly blushed. The little blonde girl slapped one hand over her mouth as her cheeks reddened. She stammered, vying for some composure and slowly letting her hand drop down to her side. What possible harm could it do? He hasn't passed yet, so why not let him try? She glanced at Naruto out of the corner of her eye, wiping a blonde lock of hair from her face as a small smile tugged at one corner of her mouth. Naruto looked at her curiously, cocking his head off to one side. She hadn't complimented him, that much was certain, but at the same time there was no disdain in her voice. She wanted him to have another chance, or so it seemed. Naruto didn't understand it. Uchiha Sasuke shook his head, ruffling his raven hair, and stared off towards the north. What a couple of morons, he thought. I want to, Iruka thought wearily, and why not? He deserves another chance. He wants to be a ninja more than anyone here. Okay Naruto, called Iruka, one chance and one only. But this is going to be more of a challenge. I want you to transform into Nara Shikamaru. Naruto, Sasuke, and Shikamaru all looked at Iruka. Great, now I get to be made a fool of, thought Shikamaru. Sasuke glanced between Iruka and Naruto, just as Naruto glanced between Sasuke and Iruka. I realize that Sasuke, Uchiha Sasuke, already performed the transformation, said the Chunin, but it should prove a challenge, seeing as how you were not told to practice it, Naruto. Do you think you're up to it? I see, thought Shikamaru. Naruto glared at the Uchiha across the field. I'll show you, he whispered to himself as he formed the ram once again. Naruto closed his eyes and sparks of blue shot from his fingers as he yelled, Henge, and erupted into a cloud of smoke. For a minute, no one moved. There was no wind to clear the smoke now, so anticipation began to build. Naruto? Asked Iruka after another quiet moment passed without any signs of the blonde. Iruka-sensei, called an almost raspy voice from inside the cloud as a silhouette began to take shape. How's this? Asked a perfect copy of Shikamaru stepping from the mist. Do I pass? Iruka almost leapt up, even going so far as to crouch, ready to burst out for joy, but quickly regained his composure and walked forward to inspect the technique. Everyone sat silent, and the masked ninja turned away towards the center of town. Shikamaru smiled, and Sasuke pretended not to notice. Ino looked on and tried not to smile, but failed, then turned to look at Sasuke. She looked over the raven-haired Uchiha, but glanced back at Naruto as Iruka inspected him, and nearly squealed with girlish delight at the Uzumaki's success. Hyuga Hinata merely pressed her fingers together and looked at the ground while trying to think of something to do to keep anyone from noticing she was blushing. Good, muttered Iruka trying to sound casual as he inspected Naruto's henge. Well, I'm impressed, perhaps even better than Sasuke's was earlier. Sasuke snapped his vision on Iruka, but then resumed staring off into space as though nothing had happened, while Sakura was slightly more vocal. Are you kidding? Shouted the young Haruno. Sasuke-kun's was way better than the cheap imitation. Iruka ignored the remark as Sasuke glared at Sakura, silencing her immediately. Ha! Yelled Naruto, poofing back to himself and pointing a finger enthusiastically at Sasuke. Hear that duck butt? Iruka-sensei said mine was better and OWW. Iruka slapped Naruto on the back of the head and told him to be quiet or fail. Duck butt. Thought nearly every student in line, turning or leaning to look at Sasuke. Hair. SC. Back in the classroom, Iruka settled everyone into their seats, took his place at the front of the class, and promptly began to congratulate the 9 students who passed the exam while consoling the 20-some who could try again next time. But by the time he got past the congratulation part, Naruto had become so wrapped up in his actually passing to notice when Iruka called his name. Needless to say, the eraser soon hurled by the angry teacher found its way to Naruto's forehead with no resistance. It connected with a thunk. Now, continued Iruka, those of you who passed have been divided up into teams which I will now read off. All eyes turned to the front. This was what they all wanted to know. These teams were essentially for life, and no one wanted to miss a minute of it. Team 7, Haruno Sakura, Uchiha Sasuke, Naruto Uzumaki. Sakura at first nearly jumped up to cheer, but realization quickly set in and suddenly wasn't sure whether to applaud or cry. Sure, she was with Sasuke, but Naruto. Was it worth it? Ino glared down at Sakura from her seat and brooded until her name was called for Team 9, along with Shikamaru and Akamichi Choji. SC. Naruto bounded towards his apartment, chanting to himself that he was one step closer to being Hokage and that he had beaten Sasuke good, and that now Sakura was sure to notice him, and all kinds of self-assuring statements, stopping every few yards to declare to the bystanders that he was going to be a ninja now and that they probably never saw that coming. Most of them just ignored him, some huffed and turned up their noses, but no one really paid him the attention. Ino walked quickly home, which was only a block from the academy, and went inside to greet her mother who was standing at the kitchen table over a roast that could feed a family twice the size of the Yamanakas. You're home early, Ino, said the woman, is everything all right? Yes, mother, replied Ino warmly, the exam was today. Oh. And how did you do, might I ask? Asked her mother. I passed, but I didn't make it onto Sasuke's team. Mrs. Yamanaka put a hand on Ino's shoulder and said she was sorry. It's not as bad as I thought it would be, but still, sighed Ino. How many others passed? 8 besides me, said Ino, including Naruto. Mrs. Yamanaka raised an eyebrow and chuckled a little. That's impressive. Well, why don't you invite him to dinner? What? Asked a very shocked Ino. I mean why? Why not? Said her mother. I mean, he's failed several years in a row, and this could be a nice way to say congratulations on finally passing. Plus, have you seen where he lives and what he eats? Everyone needs a good meal once in a while. Ino thought for a minute and then said, yeah, I think I will, but father hates Naruto and says I should too. Don't worry, sweetie, father won't be home till late tonight, so I don't think he'll mind if we don't let him know. SC. By the time he arrived at his own door, Naruto was almost too excited to notice the note that was taped there, but he ripped it off and dashed inside, going to the kitchen and taking the single, cracked bowl out of the poorly hung cabinet. He set the note aside without opening it and took out a pan from under the dripping sink. Filling it with water, Naruto set the pan on the stove and turned on the gas, not noticing the lack of the igniter's clicking. He sat at the table and picked up the note, breaking the wax seal, flipping it open. Scanning it revealed that he was invited to dinner at the Yamanaka house at 7 p.m., roughly 2 hours from now, and that it was their treat. He thought for a minute and looked over at the bowl and the unopened ramen pack and decided he didn't really want to, and that it was probably just a trick so that Ino's father could try to hit him with yet another kunai. It was then that he noticed something, two things actually. One was the smell of gas, lots of gas, and the second was the lack of flame under the pot of water on the stove. He quickly got up and turned off the stove to stop any more gas from filling the room, and walked up to the window and opened it. There was no breeze to pull out the fumes, so Naruto walked to the light switches on the wall and flipped the one for the fan to get the air moving. He had never used it before, as he wanted to keep the electric bill down, but the fumes were horrible and burning his eyes. Just as he moved the switch, he looked up and noticed the copper wire running from the switch to the fan was badly frayed as it reached the ceiling. Oh, he muttered as a spark leapt from the faulty wiring. Passers-by Naruto's apartment were knocked to the ground by a shockwave, and odd as a massive fireball exploded out the window of the housing complex on the edge of Konoha. Naruto sat against the wall covering his ringing ears and trying to catch the breath the explosion had knocked out of him. He opened one eye and looked around what had been his kitchen and living room. Fortunately, there was not much to burn. The only furniture, a decrepit couch which served as his bed, was now a smoldering pile of splintered wood, and as the structure was made of concrete and the wallpaper had been burned up quickly, there was no real damage to the building. He got up a minute later, and dusted down his blackened clothes, then decided to have a look in his closet. The doors had been blown in, but his meager wardrobe was in acceptable condition. Maybe I will take the Yamanakas up on their offer, he muttered to himself. I can't believe it. I just won't believe it, Sakura thought to herself as she meandered down the street towards her home in the northern quadrant of town. How could I get stuck with Naruto? I mean, sure, I'm on Sasuke's team, but with Naruto. It's just not fair. Who made that stupid roster anyway? She continued her mental tirade for some minutes, completely unaware that it had been the Hokage and her future sensei who has assigned her to her team, until she passed her street, and come to a far less populated section of Konoha. In fact, she would have continued on if not for the symbol painted on the building in front of her which caught her attention, the Uchiha crest. Wow, did I take a wrong turn, she muttered. She turned to leave, until she heard the clang of metal striking metal from around a corner, and a voice. It was Sasuke's voice, she realized, and she, fearing he was in a fight, promptly bounded off to see if he was alright. As she turned the corner and passed under an arch, she was suddenly in the middle of a garden of well-manicured grass and randomly placed stones as tall as herself. Around each stone was a small moat of raked sand, and in each moat there were dozens of kunai, along with a small wooden disc with a dot in the center, a target. In the middle of it all was Sasuke, so absorbed in flinging ninja stars at a small man-shaped target that moved on a system of ropes and pulleys that he seemingly failed to notice her intrusion. Before she could even say hello, Sasuke leapt up into the air and flipped upside down and around. While he was no less than 20 feet up, he jerked around in a circle and flung out his arms, spraying a hail kunai out in all directions. Some stuck into the targets roped to the rocks, some collided in midair to change course and whizzed towards the targets hidden by the rocks. The vast majority, however, merely thudded harmlessly into the sand. One stray flew straight towards Sakura, barely missing her torso and passing between her arm and side because she sidestepped just in time to save herself. She spun around and planted her back against the exterior wall, trying not to gasp from shock. It was nearly a minute before she peeked around the corner to see what had become of Sasuke's training. He just stood there, arms locked at his sides and growling. It seemed almost as if tears were welling in his eyes, though at a glance they seemed foggy and distant. Sakura looked around and saw that almost none of the kunai had made their mark, but those that did were dead in the bullseye entirely. Sasuke raised his arm and flung one last kunai at a rock to his left. With a loud thud, it buried itself almost an inch into the stone. Sasuke-kun, said Sakura coming out from behind the entryway, "Are you go home?" said Sasuke turning to stare at her. His eyes were as dark as ever, but now sharp and clear, almost animalistic. When one trains to kill, it's best he be left alone. SC. Naruto stood in front of the small house attached to a flower shop, barely a block from the academy, and glanced at the address by the front window. He looked down at the note and read the address, then looked back up at the house again. He repeated the process 2 or 3 more times before he mustered the nerve to go up and knock on the door. When nothing happened for more than a minute, Naruto considered going home, thinking that it must be some kind of prank. It wouldn't be the first time someone played him that way before. But as he turned to leave, the door opened and a relatively short woman with bleach blonde hair and turquoise eyes stepped out, followed by the pleasant aroma of wildflowers. "Good evening, Mrs. Yamanaka," said Naruto, making a rare attempt at being polite. "Thank you for inviting me. I wouldn't have had you anywhere else tonight," said the woman kindly. "It really is our pleasure, but please do come in." Naruto was surprised by the display of kindness, and was even more surprised when he stepped over the threshold and Mr. Yamanaka wasn't there to throw something at him. His hand instinctively went to the spot on the back of his head where he'd been struck by the man. "What's the matter?" asked Mrs. Yamanaka, noticing the gesture. Naruto immediately put his hand back down at his side and said, "Nothing." "You're a little early," said the woman, looking at the clock which read 5:45, and guiding Naruto, after he took off his sandals, to a couch in the small, but comfortable living room. "Dinner isn't entirely ready, and Ino is working in the garden. You could go say hello if you wanted. She might appreciate the company." Again, Naruto was shocked. Most parents screamed when he came near their children, and never had he been invited to actually play or spend time with anyone, excepting Iruka and Sarutobi. No thank you," said Naruto, not entirely sure how to react. "I wouldn't want to intrude or interrupt anything." Mrs. Yamanaka shrugged, turned to face the small table, and began arranging flowers in a vase on the otherwise unadorned stand. "You're too polite," she said. It was obvious from her voice that the smile hadn't faded from her face. "Why is she being so nice?" Naruto wondered as he watched for a minute, and then asked, "How long have you been a flower person?" trying to fill the somewhat awkward silence that had pervaded the room. She chuckled a little, turned around and shrugged again. "Well," she began, "I've been a florist, pretty much since before I can remember. My side of the family has tended Konoha's gardens for years. It's just what we do. Plant seeds, nurture the saplings and sprouts, and promote life in general." At that moment a door in the kitchen opened and Ino walked in carrying a small paper sack, and set it on the kitchen table beside a large slab of pork roast. "Mother," she called, "we were out of ginger so I took some from the garden. Is that okay?" Mrs. Yamanaka said yes, and then looked at Naruto. "But really," she began, How did the exam go? I heard you passed, and I heard you did it in style. Naruto instantly brightened. I did. Naruto said loudly. Iruka-sensei told me to henge into Shikamaru and I did. I made a perfect copy and put Sasuke to shame and everyone was staring and thinking I was awesome. Mrs. Yamanaka sat and listened, smiling as Naruto recalled the 5-minute span 100 different ways as the minutes began to roll by unnoticed. Occasionally she nodded or cocked her head off to one side and said, "Really?" Naruto was more than happy just keep talking as the time rolled by, and she was more than happy to listen, though she knew he was embellishing quite a bit. Ino stood in the kitchen, chopping up some green herb and sprinkling it over a bowl of soup. She was listening in, and rolling her eyes at most of the storytelling, and when Naruto mentioned shaming Sasuke, she nearly marched in and told him to can it, though something stopped her. At the same time though, he was entertaining. The comically exaggerated facts made for a funny story, and more than once she chuckled, not at Naruto as all of the other academy students did, but with him. The story however, couldn't last forever, and some time later the boy stopped talking, not because he wanted to mind you, but because his throat was so dry that he literally couldn't say another word. His mouth kept moving, and his hands kept illustrating the story, but no sounds escaped him. Ino noticed as his voice became raspier and drier, and when he finally stopped she looked around the corner to see what the matter was. When she saw him miming the day's events to her mother, she almost cracked up and lost it. It was the funniest thing she'd seen all day, aside maybe from the blonde Sarutobi, or Sasuke's hair after Naruto pointed out. She stopped and glared at Naruto, only then realizing just how much he had insulted the Uchiha, and that was something she would not tolerate. No one insults Sasuke and gets away with it while I'm around, she thought to herself, as she reached into one of the cabinets and pulled out some ground sinisio, which her mother would sometimes mix in with soups to act as a laxative. She sprinkled the powder over the bean soup, knowing that her mother hated that particular kind and wouldn't hesitate to pass it on to Naruto. She also fixed 2 more bowls of chicken soup, and set them on a tray. Then adopting her brightest and cheeriest smile, she carried the tray out into the living room and set it down asking if anyone wanted appetizers before dinner. Without hesitating, and before Naruto could say a thing Mrs. Yamanaka picked up the bowl of bean soup, and thanked Ino for making her favorite. Naruto picked up one of the bowls of chicken and thanked her. Ino stammered, then moved to take the bowl from her mother, who resisted and held the soup off beside her. "What are you doing?" asked the older woman. "What's the matter?" Ino was silent for a minute as both of the others stared at her. "Well, that was Naruto's soup," she said quickly. "I heard you liked beans so I decided to fix you some." Naruto smiled widely, but then said, "Nothing personal, but beans and I don't mix well if you catch what I'm saying." "But mother, I thought you said you hated bean soup," said Ino looking away from Naruto. "I did, but I've very recently acquired a taste for the stuff," said Mrs. Yamanaka, raising the bowl to take a sip of the broth. Ino couldn't help but cringe a little, but then her mother stopped short. "It smells kind of funny. Ino, what did you put in this soup?" Ino put a hand behind her head and stared at the wall, and began to list off the ingredients, making sure to skip over the laxative. "Strange," said her mother, "I've been a gardener and florist all my life. I've come to recognize the smells of thousands of different plants no matter how faint they may be, and I could have sworn I smelled something, off in here somewhere." Ino paled, and put her hands behind her back, but kept smiling and said she didn't know anything. Her mother then set down the bowl, glared wickedly at her daughter, and told Ino to go dump it down the drain before anything bad became of it. Ino obliged immediately, and Mrs. Yamanaka smiled at Naruto. "What was that all about?" asked the golden-haired nin. My daughter can be somewhat overzealous sometimes, and I'd guess that she didn't approve of when you said you humiliated Sasuke in front of the whole class, astutely reasoned the woman, standing up and politely excusing herself to the kitchen, leaving Naruto the only one in the living room. Ino sat in the kitchen rocking back and forth on one of the stools. The now empty bowl of once poisoned soup sat in the sink, completely rinsed out. Why did you do that? Asked Mrs. Yamanaka quietly, and walking into the kitchen. He's our guest, that means he's your guest too, and you decide to play a trick on him like one of those bullies at the academy. That was a cruel thing to do, Ino, especially after you wanted to invite him over. Why? Ino looked up at her mother and tried to find the words. She fumbled at first, he was insulting Sasuke. He made fun of him in front of the whole class and. How many times has Naruto been made fun of, Ino? Interrupted a now angry mother. How many times has Naruto been knocked down and kicked in front of the whole class? How many times has he had to run home because other children and even adults were throwing stones at him, simply because he crossed their path? Ino, how many times have you been the one throwing the stones, and what has he done to deserve it? He plays tricks on people, said Ino. He makes a fool of himself and says all kinds of stupid things. Mrs. Yamanaka sighed and looked Ino straight in the eyes. Ino, Naruto is absolutely starving for attention. Everyone ignores him, pretends he doesn't exist, and tells him to go away when he comes close. That wears on anyone, Ino, much more a 12-year-old boy. The reason he does what he does, is because it gets people to notice him. Even if they think he's stupid and an idiot, they still notice him, and to Naruto, even that scorn must be better than being ignored entirely. But, Ino began to protest then looked away. Her mother was silent, waiting for a response, but all Ino did was stare down at the textile floor, wanting to memorize every crack and chip but finding none in the faultless tile. But she began to protest again. Think, Ino, said the girl's mother. How would you feel? The room slipped into an uncomfortable quiet, a long and uncomfortable quiet, until the sound of a key rattling in the front door shattered the silence. Wonderful, muttered Mrs. Yamanaka. Father's home, said Ino, as both of them quickly left the kitchen and sat beside a very surprised Naruto on the couch in the living room. The door opened and a tall man with a sword across his back and hair only slightly darker than Ino stepped in. I'm home, he began to say, but stopped short when he saw exactly who was sitting in the house. Inoichi, said Mrs. Yamanaka beaming, and getting up. She walked to him and said they have a guest. Inoichi drew the sword and said he could clearly see that. Naruto's eyes widened in horror as he pushed himself back into the couch. Amy, he said loudly and gruffly, shuffling his wife to the side, what is that monster doing in my house? Mrs. Yamanaka immediately stepped in front of him and put her hands on his shoulders. Ino and I thought it would be nice to have Naruto over for dinner, seeing as how he passed his final exam at the academy with flying colors. What? Growled Kensai, you, he said pointing at Ino, invited that beast over. Yes I did father, said Ino getting up and trying to be as placating as possible, leaving a frozen Naruto on the couch, why not? What did he do for us not to be hospitable? Mrs. Yamanaka briefly glanced over at her daughter and smiled, then turned her attention back to her husband. What did he do? Echoed Inoichi furiously, what did he do? What about everything he did to Konoha? What about what he did to our family? Inoichi shoved Amy aside, and ran towards Naruto, pushing Ino to the ground and yelling for Naruto to get out. Naruto rolled away, just as the sword split the upholstery where Naruto had sat less than a second before. The blonde dashed for the open door and dove through, ducking behind a small tree near the house in the yard. He knew Inoichi had plenty official training as a ninja. The Yamanaka father was after all one of the more feared, not respected but assuredly feared, Junin in the village. There was a loud thud, as tip of a wickedly sharp sword burst through the tree, and nicked Naruto's shoulder. He got up and sprinted down the street, dodging and weaving as he went to try and avoid anything else thrown at him. Inoichi stood in the door, shouting and cursing. "Stay away from my family and my house, you little freak. You monster, don't come back." Ino was stunned. She'd never seen anyone actually try to kill Naruto before. Taunting and teasing were one thing, but this seemed unacceptable to her. Tears actually began to well in her eyes. What did he ever do to father, or mother, or me? She wondered to herself, nearly crying. What's he ever done to Konoha? SC. An hour later, Naruto sat with his back against the wall of his charred apartment. The remains of the doors to the closet had been braced against the front door and set in a hole Naruto had carved in the floor, making it virtually impossible for anything but a jutsu to break down the door. Naruto had ripped out the nails left in the wall by the previous owners and used them to stretch one of his shirts over the window to keep out prying eyes. What did I do to them? He wondered to himself over and over again. Naruto, called a voice on the other side of the fortified door, accompanied by a knock. He recognized it as Ino, and cringed, fearing she'd led her father to him. Naruto. She called again. "Listen, I'm not sure what to say, but what father did was wrong. I don't know why he is so hateful, and I don't know why everyone else is either, but I wanted to say I'm sorry for what he did." Naruto didn't answer, hoping she'd just leave, but he didn't hear her walk away, so he got up, went to the door, and looked through the peephole, just as the shirt fell away from the window, letting in the evening's orange light. To his shock, Inoichi was nowhere to be seen, and it was just Ino, carrying a brown paper sack. She set the sack down, sighed and turned to leave, though after a few steps, Naruto unbarred the door and opened it. She turned around again and walked back as he leaned down and picked up the sack, reading, "Ichiraku," on the side. "Thank you," he said, half-heartedly smiling. Ino just stood there, trying to think of something to say, but nothing seemed appropriate, so she elected to smile back. "I'd invite you in an offer to share," he began, but his voice trailed off. Ino shifted to look inside, and gasped when she saw the wreck his home had become. "What happened?" "Gas leak," he said. She wasn't sure what to do now. On the one hand, she felt so much sympathy that she wanted to tell him that her mother wasn't letting her father back in the house, which was true, as was the fact that Mrs. Yamanaka hadn't put Ino up to any of this, and that he could sleep there if he wanted. But on the other, there was still something she didn't like about him. Maybe it was prejudice, or just not wanting to let go of her past dislike of him. He must have done something, she thought to herself. "I hope things get better for you," she said, trying to sound as warm as she could, and turning again to leave. "Thanks," he said quietly, "and thanks for the ramen." "My pleasure," she called back to him. Naruto turned around and stared into his home. "What am I going to do now?" he wondered. Ino turned around and saw him standing there, then tried to convince herself that he'd be okay and that things would indeed get better for him. But, she thought, no one will let him make things better for himself, so how will things get better if no one helps him? She turned around and jogged back to Naruto, who circled to face her. "You know," she began, "Mother kicked father out because of what he did to you tonight." Naruto cocked his head off to one side a little. "That wasn't very nice of her," he said. "She didn't have to do that." "No, but he deserved it. So what I'm getting at is that we have a spare room if you need a place to stay. Quarters would be a little tight, but we'd manage if you wanted to stay, and I'd be glad to have you." Now it was Naruto's turn to be stunned. Was she offering him a place to stay? "You would do that for me?" he asked. Of course, she smiled, forcefully putting any negative thoughts out of her mind entirely. "Love to." "Well, thanks," he faltered a little. "Sure, thanks very much. Everyone needs a friend, Ino thought as they walked down the hall. The records room's sole purpose was to serve as a repository for information submitted by ninjas upon the completion or failure of a mission, rendering it one of the least visited sites in Konoha. On most nights, it was completely devoid of life aside from the family of rats that made their living off of whatever scraps were left behind by rare visitors. Tonight, however, the rats had a guest. A lone ninja had been wandering through the stacks of scrolls and the seemingly endless rows of books since before sunset, though now it was well after midnight. The small rodents trailed him silently, hoping to find some source of food he might leave behind, and they were not disappointed. The nin would periodically drop bits of breadcrumbs out of his sleeves, which the rats eagerly spirited away to the nearest of the many the dark corners. Uruka turned back to the rats and minutely smiled. No reason to let them starve when I can help it, he thought to himself as he turned back to the stacks and returned to scanning through the dates of entry, or on occasion the names of those written about that served as titles. He reached out and grabbed a particularly thin book, bound in simple brown paper. He read the title, opened it to the first page and finding what he was looking for, walked to a nearby chair to read. Hatake Kakashi. Uruka began thumbing through the pages, reading over the general topics, and browsing about the names of his associates. While most of it was nothing he hadn't seen before, given that the copy nin's life wasn't a secret to most of the older Chunin, he was startled when he arrived at the point in the records that detailed Kakashi's early days as a special Junin. There's not much he hasn't been through, thought Uruka, training under the 4th, battling in the wars, losing dear friends and eyes. Then Uruka immediately stopped sifting through the book. He had come to the page concerning Kakashi's training methods, and the fact that none of his students passed their initial test, or became real ninja, ever. Uruka, sounded a voice, raspy with age. The Chunin almost jumped, but kept his calm and simply closed the book with a loud clap. He turned around to see Sarutobi emerge from the stacks of scrolls, carrying with him that ever-present pipe. Uruka, he repeated, what are you doing here of all places, now of all times? Uruka stood up, set the book down on the seat and bowed to the Hokage. I was reading Hokage-sama, said Uruka, almost sheepishly. How did he know I was here? An interesting choice of literature, said the old man, why so nosy about Kakashi? Or are you more curious about Naruto's new sensei? Uruka looked at the ground and nodded. I would like to discuss it with you if I may, said the Chunin. Kakashi being Naruto's new sensei that is. Hummed Sarutobi curiously, what about it do you feel needs to be spoken about? Uruka looked back at the book on the chair and picked it up, opening it to the pages about Kakashi's training methods. Not one of his groups has passed, they're all sent back to the academy. I'm aware of this, said the old man, why does that concern you? Do you lack faith in your students? Not in the least Hokage-sama, but I do lack faith in Kakashi. His methods are brutal, and almost psychotic. He pits them against each other and against him, and expects them to work together. Do you feel that you've failed to equip your students for such an encounter? Asked Sarutobi, eyeing Uruka closely. I didn't before, stammered the Chunin, but now I don't really know. Maybe, but even so, why should Kakashi be so brutal with students who are barely genin? Why should he go easy on them? Sarutobi continued to question Uruka. Naruto wants to be in my place someday, and you have never told him it was beyond him. You encouraged his dream, and now he faces the first real challenge to that dream. Do you feel that you've adequately equipped him to go chase the dream you told him he could have? Uruka was silent. Sarutobi turned to walk away, opening the package he still carried, then turned back to the Chunin, now several yards away. It's not too late for you to prepare him, Uruka. He may not be your student anymore, but he's still your friend. The third took a small loaf of bread out of the box, and resumed walking, tearing off tiny chunks and tossing them to the wooden floor. And I appreciate you feeding my rats, laughed the Hokage as he turned a corner and was gone. Not too late to teach him something. But what could prepare Naruto for someone like Kakashi? Thought Iruka. A squad of 10 genin would have trouble getting one of those bells in. Then it hit him, and Iruka stood up, and walked quickly out of the building. At a little before 2 a.m., Iruka stood outside a somewhat ramshackle wooden building, silently making his way from shadow to shadow. His usual Chunin vest was replaced by a black, loose-fitting suit, and a cowl that hid his face. He made his way to a window on the north face of the structure, and slipped inside unnoticed by the patrol that came around the corner only fractions of a second before. Once inside, Iruka darted from room to room like a shade, slipping by every tripwire and dodging every obstacle in his path. He had been here before, but rarely. Still, he remembered where every trap was laid, making them easy to avoid as he made his way down narrow corridors to the very center room. The door that barred his way was thick and held closed by no less than a dozen sturdy locks. But if there was anything that being a ninja of Konoha had taught him, it was that no room is impregnable. Iruka pulled a black scroll with ghostly thin, white letters from a slip in his sleeve and placed against the door. Biting his thumb and wiping the blood across the scroll, the Chunin stepped back as the paper slowly dissolved into the metal frame. There were several clicks, and the door swung open on well-oiled hinges, the locks undone and bypassed entirely. Inside, Iruka encountered almost total darkness, but it was easy enough for a ninja to tell that there was only one table in the room, on which sat a thick scroll. Strange, thought Iruka, no traps of any kind. He made his way towards the table, meeting no resistance, save when a rat scurried away to avoid being stepped on. Iruka reached out and took the scroll, and opened it up revealing to him all manner of jutsu, both hidden and forbidden. Having gotten what he needed, Iruka replaced the scroll and reset the locks, then slipped away, just as invisibly as he had arrived, dodging every trap, and leaping the outer court wall with the agility of a cat. Once outside, he leaned against the wall and relaxed for a moment. Hello? Asked a familiar voice from a thicket of trees. The Chunin prepared to bound away, but hesitated when he saw the Hokage step out of the night. Sarutobi casually walked by the nin, and kneeled down to a small patch of grass beside the wall. A rat sauntered out haughtily, and the Hokage rubbed it behind the ears with his finger, and passed it a small chunk of bread from his sleeve. You've got to be kidding, thought Iruka. You know, Iruka, said the old man standing up, what you did in there was very illegal, and by law I should have killed you on sight when I saw you jump over the wall. Iruka slumped. He knew he would likely hang for this, or at least spend years in jail. And, continued Sarutobi, not showing any signs of anger or frustration, if it had been for anyone but Naruto, I would have. This time however, I didn't see or hear anything, nor did the friends I had tell you. The Hokage turned and walked away. Iruka was speechless. Oh, and Naruto is staying with the Yamanakas, so you should look for him there, said Sarutobi before he disappeared into the gloom. Iruka looked down at the grass. Two beady eyes looked back at him, watching his every move. The Chunin sighed, and dashed off in the opposite direction, towards the flower shop. It was just after 2:20 a.m. when Iruka arrived at the Yamanaka family home and business, so he couldn't simply knock on the door, everyone was asleep. So he elected to jump up onto a windowsill and peer in. To his amazement, Iruka's luck had held, and he saw Naruto laying on his back on the couch in the living room. Iruka took off the cowl and slid the window open just a little. Naruto, he whispered. No response. Naruto, he said only slightly louder. The blonde sat up and stared bleary-eyed at his old teacher. Iruka-sensei, he asked, rubbing his eyes clean of sleep. What are you doing here? Naruto, come here for a minute, said Iruka, there's something I need to show you. Naruto got up and walked up to the window and Iruka stepped back onto the lawn and motioned for the blonde to follow, as he dashed off. Despite being tired and only in his shorts, Naruto followed Iruka, now awake entirely due to the cool night air. He caught up with the Chunin and they stopped in the academy schoolyard. "What are we doing here?" asked Naruto. Iruka took out a hastily scrawled piece of parchment, and handed it to Naruto. "Call it a graduation present," said Iruka smiling and forming the ram with his hands. "That should help you later," he said, just before disappearing in a cloud of smoke. Naruto was stunned, but looked down at the parchment. It depicted two hands forming a strange seal, and a brief description of a new way to mold chakra to form, cage buncheons. The blonde set down the parchment, and mimicked the hand positions it showed, then let some chakra flow around the seal, until he could feel the jutsu begin to take shape. He released the chakra, and said, "Kage Bunshin no Jutsu," and instantly there was a puff of smoke beside him, that quickly revealed another Naruto. It was nearly dawn when Naruto approached the Yamanaka abode. The window he'd left through was still open, making him think that neither of the other residents were awake yet, but even so, as he approached he was still cautious to remain undetected. He had almost begun to trust that the Yamanakas didn't mean him any harm, or at least not Ino or her mother, but that didn't stop him from worrying what someone else might do if they saw him entering a house through a window. That wasn't a problem however, as the streets were all but empty, the only other people being a tired shopkeeper or two, who were getting ready to open their store. So Naruto had no trouble slipping in quietly, and making his way back to the couch. He readjusted the bedding Mrs. Yamanaka had given him, plopped down, and was asleep before his head hit the pillow. A sizzling sound, and the smell of honey flooded the living room, waking Naruto from a restful sleep, and reviving him with a strong hunger. He got up, stretched widely and walked to the open kitchen door. Mrs. Yamanaka was in front of the stove, and Ino stood beside her at the sink. From the looks of things, the older woman was frying some kind of strip soaked in oil in a pan, and Ino was washing green beans in a strainer. Mrs. Yamanaka turned around, looked at Naruto, and smiled warmly. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said, "you slept in a little bit." Ino turned around and greeted him with a quiet grin. Naruto stretched again and walked forward. "Good morning," he responded, "what time is it?" "Almost 9, said Ino. "We need to be to the academy in an hour to meet our squad leaders, but we have time for breakfast if you'd like some." Naruto nodded, walked to the table and sat down, again smelling the honey but not knowing where the aroma came from. All that was on the table was a simple earthen vase housing a dozen white roses, and there was nothing around the kitchen that looked like honeysuckle, or a beehive. "What's that you're cooking?" asked Naruto. Mrs. Yamanaka turned around, turning off the stove as she did, and tipped the pan so that he could see the 6 orange strips that were now fried to a crispy finish. "These are called aronerve," she said, "and they make a wonderful meal any time, but especially at breakfast." "Why's that?" he returned, curious now. "Well, first of all they smell wonderful, like honey and butter mostly. But they're also amazingly nutritious, high in all kinds of vitamins and minerals. And aside from that, they keep your skin in healthy condition. We've been having them for breakfast for almost 5 years now." Ino broke in, "I'm a good cook, but it takes a lot of skill to make it right, so mother cooks it and I watch and try to learn." Mrs. Yamanaka picked up the aronerve with a spatula and put 2 strips on each of 3 plates laying out, and Ino dumped a goodly portion of the beans beside them. The 2 of them each took a plate, Ino took 2, and set them on the circular table and sat down to eat. Naruto cut up the aronerve, and took 1 bite then stopped. "This is delicious," he said with his mouth half full. "It tastes like, well, something really good." Ino smiled and after she finished a bite said, "It always tastes different to each person, and it can change depending on what you're in the mood for, but it's always great." I've normally thought it was like some combination of rice, sugar, and chocolate. Naruto grimaced slightly at the revelation of Ino's tastes, and took another bite. You know, he began, I really don't know what it tastes like. Sweet but not really, but it has some kind of, well, he trailed off and began to mull it over while he ate. Maybe you just don't know what you like yet, said Ino. What do you normally eat? Ramen, responded Naruto. Okay, what else? Chicken flavored ramen. No, I mean what besides ramen? Naruto was silent for a moment. I eat Ichiraku ramen a lot. You mean ramen is all you eat? Asked Ino, nearly stunned. Basically. The two slowly digressed into a conversation about all the different kinds of foods there were, with Naruto asking questions or mentioning there was a ramen flavor like that. Ino would then answer whatever he asked about food and herbs used for seasoning, and ask him questions about ramen. While one was speaking, the other was eating and listening. Mrs. Yamanaka, through the whole discussion, sat quietly and finished her breakfast, then got up and took the now empty plates in front of Naruto and Ino, who jointly said thank you, then continued to talk. The older woman listened in with greater interest when the topic shifted to ninja arts when Ino mentioned soldier pills, and their uses. It surprised her how much her daughter had learned from the academy, and how well she combined it with the knowledge she gained in the gardens. The girl was already a skilled herbalist, rattling off to Naruto the ingredients for all kinds of poisons and their cures, as well as many more beneficial concoctions like energy drinks and painkillers. Naruto, on the other hand, while not in terms of plants and the like, was more book smart than people gave him credit for. Though he slept in class a lot, he was routinely throwing out obscure facts about the Hokages whenever it related to the subject. So, thought Mrs. Yamanaka, the boy who wants to be Hokage knows everything about his predecessors. Why am I not surprised? She smiled to herself and began to wash the dishes. When the topic changed to the fourth Hokage, Naruto began to take over the conversation, while Ino would ask questions about the Great Wars and such things. Naruto didn't have all the answers, maybe 3/4 of them, but when he didn't know he quickly filled in with his own speculations. Where did you learn this? Ino asked. When I was admitted to the academy, Naruto began, Iruka sensei was the only teacher who would really teach me anything. He taught me to read, and gave me a book on Konoha's history. I didn't really like history, but studying that book was more time that Iruka would spend with me, so I studied it a lot. It got to the point where I had most of the facts committed to memory, but I kept studying with Iruka, until somebody stole it. After that I just sort of got tired of school. That's horrible, said Ino. It's what happened. Naruto responded. They slipped into silence for a minute or two, until Mrs. Yamanaka cleared her throat, and nodded her head towards the clock. It was 5 till 10. Both of the 12-year-olds looked up, and nearly screamed. Geez! Shouted Ino, hurry or we'll be late. SC. Naruto and Ino raced down the quarter-mile stretch to the academy, both praying that they would arrive before their new Junin instructors, or who knows what might happen. Naruto hopped the fence, followed quickly by Ino, and threw open the side door to the first-floor hallway. They both bounded in and Naruto said to follow him, as he opened another door that led into a stairwell. They ascended rapidly and burst out on the second floor, turned a corner, and dashed into a large classroom. There were 7 other young ninjas in the room, the other graduates from their class, all turned around and staring at them. They all synchronously looked up at the clock. Ino and Naruto followed their gaze. It was 1 till 10. They had made it with seconds to spare, literally, and went to the front. There they separated and went to their own teams. Ino took a seat next to Nara Shikamaru, while Naruto sat on Sakura's left, and waited for the last of the seconds before 10 to tick away. At 10 on the dot the door to the class opened, and a tall man smoking a cigarette entered. His hair was jet black spiked up, and held in place by a bandana. He shifted the cigarette around his lips and looked over the group, his scarred face hard and seemingly judgmental, while at the same time, adventurous. Team 9, he called out, catching Ino's attention, come with me. The three genin stood up and walked towards him without question, and the four of them made their way from the room. Ino threw one glance back over her shoulder before the door closed, and the rest of the students lost sight of them. There was a moment's pause, and no one said a word. Kiba and Akamaru merely sat together, staring at the same point on the blank wall. Sasuke, as was his custom, glared off into space, despite Sakura's subtle attempts to get his attention, such as flapping her hair over her shoulder and nearly hitting him in the face, or loudly clearing her throat when it was obvious she didn't need to. Why won't he notice me? She wondered after several moments, slightly deflated. He better get his rear in gear or I'll put it there. Inner Sakura. Naruto looked around the room, glancing from face to face, grimacing when he saw Sasuke, and trying to think of something to do. He didn't wait much longer, as the door opened again right at 10:10, and a tall woman with glossy, unkempt black hair, and blood-red eyes walked in. Her dress was made of several strips of white linen with black stripes, and seemed to shift as she walked. Team 8, come with me, she said with authority, but not harshness. Hinata, Kiba, and Shino all stood up and began to walk to her. Hinata looked timidly back at Naruto, who smiled at her reassuringly. She gulped and pressed her index fingers together and proceeded out of the room, leaving the last three, the members of Team 7, to wait on their instructor. They all waited in anticipation. Even Sasuke began to show signs of fretting, as the minutes rolled by. Away in the treetops just west of the academy, Ino, Shikamaru, Choji, and the man with the cigarette all sat on an especially wide branch in silence. The Junin was looking them over, and occasionally mumbling slightly to himself. Well, he finally said loudly with a smile, my name's Sarutobi Asuma, and let me congratulate you on graduating the academy. That can be quite a feat, and not something I'm going to play down. You're all officially genin now, which means you'll be recognized as adults in the ninja community. Again, congratulations. Now, I know your names and I'm sure you know each other's, but for the sake of being official and cordial, let's go around and introduce ourselves. You can add a personal goal or dream or something if you want. You start, he said, pointing at Choji. Me? Asked the somewhat hefty nin. Well, I'm Akamichi Choji, and I don't really have a goal other than to become a great ninja like my dad someday. I want to join the guard if I can. Sounds good to me, said Asuma, shrugging and motioning to Ino. She was hesitant, but soon found her nerve, and bluntly stated, I want to be the best kunoichi ever, even better than the Sanin, Tsunade. A steep goal indeed, but I don't doubt that you can manage it if you commit yourself to it fully. Said Asuma. How about you there in the net? What pretty clouds, thought Shikamaru, pleasantly in a daze. Oh, for the love of! Shouted Naruto, standing on top of a desk. Where the heck is he? Our Junin should have been here an hour ago at the latest. The blonde plopped down on the desk, and simmered for a minute. Shut it, said Sasuke calmly, he'll get here when he gets here. What did you just say to me? Asked an even angrier Naruto. I told you to shut it, repeated Sasuke, folding his hands in front of his chin. Yeah, said Sakura, Sasuke-kun is right. But he better not be much later or I'll slug him so hard. Inner Sakura again. But he's more than an hour late. Shouted Naruto, pointing to the clock. Neither Sakura nor Sasuke responded, so Naruto began to pace around and try to occupy his time. After another few minutes, he grinned wickedly, and dashed up to the front of the room, drawing some measure of notice from his teammates. This'll teach him, said Naruto, grabbing an eraser and sprinting to the door. Sasuke cocked his head slightly off to one side. What are you doing? he asked as Naruto stuck the eraser up in the door, and closed said door just enough to hold said eraser in place. Teaching him to be late, chuckled Naruto as he hopped down the stairs and sat in his seat. Sakura examined the trap, then sighed and muttered something about how stupid an idea it was, and how no real ninja would fall for that, just as footsteps began to echo just outside in the hall. Sorry, said a man in a mask, popping his head through the door, and nudging it so the eraser fell on top of his head with puff of dust, a satisfying thump. Naruto began to laugh, and Sasuke stiffened with shock to the point that he nearly fell out of his chair. Sakura merely stood there not believing what had just happened. Late, continued the man, acting as though nothing had happened, but you see, I was wandering this beautiful path to the academy, when I saw a rose, and couldn't help but stop to smell it. Well, it was an especially aromatic flower, and I simply got lost in it, and began to aimlessly wander the path in a delirium. Naruto was quieted instantly, let down by how the nin had seemingly been unaffected, while Sasuke quickly recovered his composure, and Sakura began to wonder if this guy could really even be a ninja, much less the respected Junin she recognized as the copy ninja Kakashi. He had silver hair that was spiked up, a mask covering his lower face added a great sense of mystery, and he hid one eye behind his forehead protector. He definitely looked the part, but falling for such a simple trap left Sakura needing some convincing. Please follow me, said the nin, opening the door wider so all of them could pass through. Team 7 got up, and cautiously trailed the instructor as he led them down the hall. That's Hatake Kakashi. Something must be up if he walked into that trap like that, whispered Sakura to Sasuke, as they turned up a flight of stairs to the rooftop exit. There they halted. Before you pass through this door, I want you to know, Kakashi said solemnly, that numerous traps lie on the other side. You will be ninja the second your hand touches the bar, and as soon as you open it you will open the floodgates of numerous trials and tests. Some will praise you, and others will seek revenge upon you. Do you think you're ready? Naruto, without a second's hesitation, shouted, I'm going to be Hokage one day, so I'll have to learn to welcome challenges and trials. He barreled past Kakashi and the others, and threw open the door. He walked boldly outside into the sunshine, basking in the radiance of his first day as a ninja. There was a sudden whoosh, and Naruto looked up just in time to see a bucket of water topple from a perch above the door, tip upside down, dump him in its icy contents all over him, and blacken his sight as it fell over his face. The Kakashi standing beside the other two genin disappeared in a large poof of smoke, and another Kakashi, the real one this time, dropped down seemingly from nowhere to take the clone's place. Naruto fumbled around for a few seconds, while Sakura began to laugh. Kakashi looked over at her, and shook his head. She stopped immediately and watched as he walked over to a still struggling Naruto. We'll call it even now, said Kakashi, pulling the bucket off of the genin's head. That should teach you not to prank a Junin. He may just fall into it so he can justify revenge. Some Junin are really twisted and sadistic like that. Naruto just smiled sheepishly, half humiliated, half amused. He could tell by the slight upward twist in his sensei's mask that the Junin was not angry. So, began Kakashi, you all seem to know my name already, meaning you have me at a bit of a disadvantage. We didn't expect there to be 9 graduates this year, so I was a last-minute call and didn't get the roster. For that reason, let's go around and introduce ourselves, if for no one's sake but mine. Oh, and do add a personal goal that you'd like to meet, so I can get to know you a little better. He pointed at Sakura and asked her to begin. She sat there for a second, then stammered, I'm Haruno Sakura, and my goal is, she blushed and stopped, my goal is to, she glanced over at Sasuke, and grinned but quickly put her hands in front of her face and shook her head. Maybe we'll come back to you, Sakura, said Kakashi, how about you there in the blue? Sasuke, who had calmly folded his hands in front of his mouth, took a breath. My name is Uchiha Sasuke, and as for my goals, there's only one, he said quietly, with all the composure of an executioner. I'm going to kill a certain man. All three of the others stared at him for a moment. Sakura and Naruto looked on in surprise and curiosity, while Kakashi was unreadable. Sasuke never faltered under their gaze, as a minute ticked slowly by. Who would that be? Naruto finally asked, breaking the silence. Sasuke glared over at him. Just someone unimportant to you, he answered. Naruto wasn't quite quick enough to catch the faint upward twitch of Sasuke's mouth, nor did he notice Kakashi's concerned look. Well, said an obviously uncomfortable Junin, closing his visible eye and putting a hand on the back of his head, that's very interesting Sasuke. How about you in the orange? Here we go, thought the copy nin. A still dripping Naruto leapt up and raised a fist above his head. I'm Naruto Uzumaki. And I'm going to be the Hokage someday. Sakura silently mouthed the words as Naruto shouted them. Naruto looked over at Sakura, deflated yet again. Yes, that's a lofty goal Naruto, said Kakashi, but if you work hard you might get there someday. Now that that's done with, I think it's time we got down to some of the details on the test you'll be taking tomorrow. Wait, said a less than pleased Naruto, we just took a test to graduate from the academy. Why do we have to take another? I thought we were going to go on missions and get paid and that kind of stuff. You will go on missions and get paid, said Kakashi calmly, but first we need to assess just what level of missions you're ready for. If you can only handle AD or C level, then we sure wouldn't want to take on AB unless we trained you up to par for it, now would we? This will partly be a test to see how much you have to learn to survive in the real world. But Kakashi-sensei, said Sakura, only Chunins are allowed to go on B-level missions. And we're only genin. Very good Sakura, but should we be needed for AB mission, or if a simpler one became complicated and more dangerous, then we need to be ready. It's not uncommon for AC to turn into AB, or even an A. Said the copy nin, but yes Naruto, depending on how you do tomorrow, it might be a very short time before we start going on missions. Great! Shouted the blonde, when do we leave then? Kakashi looked up at the sky and thought for a moment. How about we meet at the Old South Bridge tomorrow at 10 am sharp? Everyone agreed, and Kakashi dismissed them but turned to Naruto and asked to speak with him in private for just a moment. What's the matter Kakashi-sensei? Asked Naruto once Sasuke and Sakura were out of earshot. Naruto, what happened to your apartment? It looks like a jutsu went horribly wrong in there. Said Naruto hesitantly, not questioning ninja intelligence. You see I was training with a super powerful fire technique that I thought up and it went sort of wrong. Naruto stopped when he saw the, don't try to pull one over on me, look on his teacher's face. There was a gas leak, and a spark from the fan set it off. I'm okay though, really. Alright, said Kakashi, do you need a place to stay? The Hokage told me to tell you his mansion was open if you decide you'd like to stay there from now on. You'd have everything and the Hokage would, literally, treat you like the son you'd be well taken care of. Naruto grinned, that's really nice of him and all, but I'm staying with the Yamanakas. They're good people I think, but thank the old man for me anyway. Plus I was going to see if Sakura wanted to go get ramen or something. I don't have much, but she would be worth it. Kakashi smiled through his mask and nodded, that's very thoughtful of you Naruto. Here, make it my treat. He held out a small bag that jingled when it moved, and offered it to Naruto. No thanks Kakashi-sensei, said Naruto beaming, I want it to be my treat, because they are after all my new team and we should be nice to each other because of it. The masked nin nodded and grinned, then disappeared in a blast of smoke, leaving Naruto the sole occupant of the rooftop. He turned towards the door to the stairs, and meandered his way down to the first floor, but upon hearing voices, he stopped at a corner. He recognized them as Sasuke and Sakura talking quietly, and almost walked around to greet them and invite them to dinner, but when he heard his name he froze and listened in. But why? He heard Sakura ask. Just really bad luck, that are them trying to balance us out by sticking us with a loser. Answered Sasuke. But, does he have to be on our team? Sakura asked angrily. Couldn't it have been Shino or Kiba? Hell, I'd take that Yamanaka slut over Naruto. All he ever does is run around screaming, and get in the way of, well, everything. Do you really think I care? Responded Sasuke. As long as he doesn't cost us a mission or our lives, does it really matter how much an idiot that loser is? But he very well may cost us the mission. Maybe he'll die in the process. Naruto turned around and walked away. He'd heard enough. He paced towards the door, looking straight at the ground in front of his feet. After a step or two, his vision began to blur, and warm tears formed at the corners of his eyes. After a dozen steps, the tears flowed down his face unchecked and unnoticed, and as he reached the door, Naruto broke into a blind run. He closed his eyes, clenched his jaw, and just concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other as fast as he could. Direction didn't matter. Neither did distance. All he cared about was running away from them. He ignored the people in the street, and they did the same. He ran past all the shops and homes, not deviating from his path. He opened his eyes after a moment but still didn't see anything at all. "SC. Ino, you're almost 3 hours late," said Mrs. Yamanaka as her daughter walked in the door, and set a backpack on the coffee table. "Sorry mother, Asuma sensei caught up with me and told me we're going to go on our first mission tomorrow, and then I went to Ichiraku for some ramen. They actually do make good food," said Ino, stepping up behind her mother as the older woman washed a dish in the kitchen sink. "They do. That's wonderful dear, what will you be doing?" "I don't know." He said it was a surprise, but, Ino paused, "Hey, where's Naruto? I thought he'd be back by now." I thought he might be with you." "Do you think something happened to him?" "Probably not. He might have just thought of something to do, or maybe he just went out with his team. Anyway, I've got to go and tend the roses. You know how frail they can be." "Yes, I do," said Mrs. Yamanaka, looking out the window, "but maybe the roses can wait. You might go see that Naruto's not getting into trouble or something." Ino paused for a moment, looked towards the front door, then at the door to the nursery and garden. Her mother watched her carefully from under a lock of hair that had fallen into her slender face. "I guess they can," said Ino. "I'll be back in a little bit then. It's almost 6, be careful dear." Ino left the house without her backpack, and forgot to shut the door behind her as she walked briskly down the street. I'd take that Yamanaka slut over him. They're trying to balance us out by sticking us with such a loser. What an idiot. The words bounced around in Naruto's head, repeating over and over again, as he huddled high up in a tree on the abandoned police station's expansive grounds. The branch was barely thick enough to hold a child, but Naruto sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, completely still except for when an occasional sob he failed to hold back sent a small tremor through him. "I don't want him on my team. He'll screw up the mission. Maybe he'll die in the process." He had his arms lain across his knees, and his face buried in one of those soaked sleeves. It was a windless evening, and the sunset allowed almost no light into the boy's hiding place, but even so, the bright orange fluoresced in the dim glow. What did I do to any of them?" Naruto asked the silence, looking up and wiping his tear-streaked, pain-carved face on his dry sleeve. "I never hurt any of them. I. His head fell back onto his arm, and he began to tremble once more. Naruto. Ino called loudly into the gloom, as she wandered some of the less traveled roads in Konoha. "Naruto." Nowhere did anyone respond to the name, except with a grimace. "He's up there. Ino whirled around and put her hands out in front of her in the shape of a triangle, ready to fight the man beside her. My name's Hitaki Kakashi, said the nin. I'm Naruto's teacher, and he's up there. He pointed up at the tip of a tree a block away. Ino's gaze followed and she looked throughout the branches. I don't see him, said Ino, lowering her hands but remaining cautious of the new arrival. You won't unless you're right beneath him, but he's there, and has been for some hours now. What's he doing up there? I don't know, Kakashi sighed through his mask. He won't talk to me, and he won't even look up when I call to him. For that boy to not respond, something very bad must have happened. God, is he hurt? Ino shouted, and dashed off without waiting for an answer. Very much so, Kakashi exhaled without moving. Ino dashed the block between her and the tree, and looked up through the branches. Sure enough, there was a fleck of orange near the top. Naruto, she called. There was a slight shuffle from the dark shape but nothing more. Naruto, she yelled again, it's me, are you okay? No response came, and Ino began to pace around a little, before jumping up, and without a second thought, climbing the tree. Even for a ninja it was difficult work. The tree was a bramble and bore thorns some inches long that snagged and tore at her. But Ino kept climbing, even ignoring the blood drawn when a thorn slashed her cheek. Naruto, she asked quietly, after she reached a branch level with his and swung herself up. He didn't respond, but simply sat there, staring off into space with an exhausted and grief-stricken expression. Are you all right? What did I do to be hated so much? He asked in a whisper. Ino looked across, wanting to go and sit beside him, but the branches were too thin, and the gap between them was greater than she could reach across. Ino in a bold move reached up and grabbed a branch a little less than midway between them, and hung over the gap, trying to be close enough to see his face in the dim light. Naruto, she said, pained and almost crying, what happened? They all hate me, said Naruto, as he put his head back on his knees and whimpered. Naruto, some people may be cruel, but there are people here who care about you. You don't. He shouted looking up at her, angry and tearing up again. You were one of the first ones to throw stones or kick sand at me. You were right there beside all the rest. Laughing and smiling while I was curled up in a ball on the ground. Ino was silent, horrified by the realization that she had helped put him in this state, maybe not at this point, but that she was one of the people who tortured him before and this is what her actions had helped to cause. She knew it was partially her fault. It was a thought that had been twisting her stomach for a day or two now, but not like this now. This was the culmination of what had been done to him for years on end. Naruto, she mumbled, reaching out as far as she could. She barely touched him on the shoulder, and he looked up at her, the anger replaced by emptiness in his eyes. I'm sorry, Naruto. I was wrong then. He just stared at her, and she looked back at him, neither knowing what to say. I really am, and hope you'll forgive me. Silence enveloped the tree, and neither moved. Ino ignored the rough bark wearing at her hand, and the thorns wrapping the tree digging into her side. As the minutes rolled by, Naruto's face slowly softened and he breathed easier. Ino reached her hand out to him again, and he reluctantly took it and stood up. He looked at her and exceedingly weary, let a small smile cross his face. Let's go home, Ino said smiling, weakly but genuinely. All was quiet at the Yamanaka abode that night. Mrs. Yamanaka had not asked any questions when Naruto and her daughter arrived well after dark. She merely fetched a small box of herbal remedies and patched up several small cuts and lacerations on both of them. No one spoke throughout the ordeal, and Naruto collapsed on the couch immediately afterwards and fell into a deep sleep. Ino got up, said good night, and began to walk towards her room. Mrs. Yamanaka smiled as her daughter turned the corner. I'm proud of you, little one, she thought remembering how Ino left to find Naruto almost without question. You're growing up into someone wonderful. She turned her attention back to Naruto, and ran her fingers through his hair once or twice. It'll be alright, she whispered, getting up and shutting off the light. No one is going to hurt you here. She turned around, and left the room, leaving Naruto to amble in the comfort of his own dreams. Ino, however, tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep. She'd try laying on her side, getting up and changing into different pajamas, switching sides, but she just couldn't stop her mind from racing back to the day's events. I was one of the people who helped crush him, she heard herself think the words dozens of times until, finally, she dozed off to them. The unconsciousness that gripped her was filled with dozens of colorful images, but they were all incoherent. None of them made any sense whatsoever. She could, however, make out voices in the clutter of images. They were yelling and screaming, laughing and crying, all at once, creating a roar in her mind that caused her to toss violently in bed. Ino, an unrecognizable voice said in the distance. Be quiet. She heard herself bark, and felt her hands press against her ears in an attempt to blot out the noise. Suddenly it was quiet. She opened her eyes and looked around, lowering her hands from her ears and taking in the stillness of the field she stood in. It was midday during the summer in a warm pasture filled with wildflowers. Off in the distance were 4 figures clustered together, 2 little girls and their mothers. Mother, said Ino, walking towards the figures. Sure enough, as her vision sharpened, one of the women was her mother, and the other she recognized as Mrs. Haruno. It was the pink hair that gave it away really. The 2 children she realized after a moment were Sakura and herself, picking the flowers, weaving them together and laughing. The older Ino heard the bustling of children and turned to look around. Several more young girls were gallivanting off in the fields towards the 2 women, carrying armfuls of appealing plants. Her mother and Mrs. Haruno received the children, and together the whole of them began playing games in the field. Slowly that image faded, leaving only a dark void for Ino to wander in, until she turned around and found herself in some kind of fenced-in park-like area the size of a quarter city block. The academy playground, she realized when she looked around and saw the buildings all around and the children playing on the equipment. Some were scattered around in small groups, playing with toys, but most were off on the practice field playing a game of soccer. Ino, however, was drawn to look to the east, on the swing set where a lone child sat. It was Naruto, but much younger, no older than 7. Naruto, she yelled, trying to get his attention and jogging that way. But before she arrived, the soccer ball landed in the dust by his feet, propelled by an especially bad kick. The young Naruto picked it up, and stood. He looked towards the group of players who were now walking from the field towards him. That's ours, shouted the foremost of the group, a child with blue hair and a green t-shirt, as he reached Naruto. Give it here. Naruto grinned and held out the ball with both hands. Do you think I could play? He asked. I'm new and. No, shouted the other boy, snatching the ball and kicking Naruto in the shin. As Naruto crumpled down to hold his leg, another student, a girl with auburn hair, came up behind him, put her foot on his back and drove him to the ground. Naruto fell in a heap, as a mob mentality took control of the group. My mom says you're a bad person, shouted a young girl, kicking dirt all over him. My dad says it's all right if I do this to you, screamed a boy who quickly kicked Naruto in the back. The young boy on the ground curled up and covered his head, crying and trying to protect himself as the children took turns kicking and hitting him. Stop it, shouted Ino, standing in front of Naruto and putting her arms out. You're hurting him. What are you doing? The children passed through her like phantasms, and continued to beat on Naruto, some throwing rocks, others kicking sand, all while the recess monitor stood by and looked the other way. Stop it! Shrieked Ino at the top of her lungs as tears flooded her eyes. Slowly, as Ino watched, the crowd began to thin as one by one the children faded from existence. Soon it was just Naruto laying crumpled up on the ground, and one other child standing a few feet off. It was Ino, her younger self. Help him, cried the older doppelganger. The younger Ino looked down at Naruto, then back towards the academy as the school bell rang. She walked over and knelt down on one knee by him and put her hand on the ground. The older Ino smiled, and collapsed to her knees, relief flooding her heart as Naruto looked up with a tear-streaked face. He smiled very weakly. The younger looked between Naruto and the school several times over the course of the next minute. Then, not to be left out, she took a handful of dirt and threw it in Naruto's face. She heard Naruto whimper, then smiled and bounded off to the academy. As the vision faded into blackness, Ino was horror-struck. She fell back and lay on insubstantial ground, stunned and heartbroken. She put her hands over her face and began to sob. Ino, someone said quietly. Ino moved her hands and looked up at Naruto through tear-stung eyes. He was sitting next to her on the edge of her bed with his hand on her shoulder. The girl didn't hesitate at all. She lurched up and threw her arms around his neck, and buried her face in his shoulder. I'm sorry, she cried quietly, trying desperately to keep some control of herself. Forgive me, I was so. Now she simply broke down and wept bitterly. Naruto, not needing any explanation but already knowing exactly what she thought, put his arms around her and held her firmly. I forgive you, he said quietly, and letting her cry. It's all right. No, she sobbed, no it's not. I was so horrible to you. I kicked you, threw dirt in your face, called you names. None of that is all right, I'm not all right, I was evil. I stole your book and tore it up. I'm sorry Naruto, I was horrible, horrible. Naruto was silent, but didn't let go of her. They just sat there as time went by. Ino slowly stopped crying but her grip never loosened as she clutched at his sleeves. Naruto, I'm so sorry, she whispered in a strained voice, feeling like she was made of lead, I didn't know what. Naruto leaned back and put 2 fingers on her lips to quiet her. I forgive you, he said again, this time more quietly, but with a small smile on his face. Why? She asked softly. Naruto grinned a little more widely. What kind of person would I be if I couldn't forgive someone who genuinely asked it of me? Especially someone who's been so kind to me. Ino closed her eyes, suddenly lighter. Who taught you to be so kind? She asked, her voice calmer now. No one has to teach you to do the right thing, said Naruto. But it helps when you have a kind old man to show you the way. But for now, he continued, it's late and we both have things to do tomorrow. She nodded and slowly released her grip on him. He did the same and she leaned back. Sorry to wake you, he said with a smile, but you sounded like you were having a pretty bad nightmare up here. Ino nodded and Naruto turned to walk out of the room. Naruto, she said as he put his hand on the knob. He looked back at her with a somewhat quizzical look. Thank you, she said. He lowered his head, smiled at her, and closed the door. He'll make a grand Hokage someday, Ino thought just as she drifted off to a peaceful sleep. The next morning was bright and clear. The sky was cloudless and warm sunshine shone through the windows of the Yamanaka house. All in all, it was the start of a gorgeous day. The smell of honey awoke Ino, and she sat up in bed. What a night, she thought, stretching, and looking at the clock, it was 7 a.m. She rose and showered, then feeling refreshed and energetic, changed into her typical purple attire and went downstairs. When she entered the kitchen, she saw her mother was, as always, cooking the aronerve in the same skillet she always used, and Naruto was sitting at the table reading a piece of paper. Good morning, she said and walked to the table. The others looked up at her, and warmly returned the greeting, as Ino took a seat next to Naruto and looked over his shoulder. What's that? She asked, sounding playfully curious. A letter from Kakashi sensei, said Naruto, shifting so she could read it. It details what my team is doing today. What? Ino asked incredulously after reading for a few seconds. He wants you to skip breakfast. That's silly. You won't have any stamina at all to work at the test. That does seem kind of strange, said Mrs. Yamanaka. Naruto nodded. I know, but that's what Kakashi says to do, so I'll trust him. He doesn't seem like a sinister guy to me, he said, remembering back to when the copy nin offered him the money to take Sakura out. I'm sure he has a reason for it. He very well may, said Ino, but I think it's a bad idea. You should at least eat a little, even if it's just one strip of the Aronerve. Naruto thought for a minute, and was just about to decline the offer, when Mrs. Yamanaka set a plate in front of him, that had just one thin strip on it. She was smiling, and nodded in agreement with her daughter. I suppose you're right, he said, cutting it into bite-sized pieces. After all, I don't want to run out of energy. Mrs. Yamanaka fixed 2 additional plates and set them on the table, then took a seat next to her daughter, and breakfast commenced. The 3 of them began to talk about the upcoming day, and Mrs. Yamanaka made it no small point to tell them just how proud she was that they had both made it and were officially ninja. Naruto laughed and confidently said he never doubted he'd be a ninja, and Ino agreed and commented on how that final exam went at the academy, then chuckled as she recalled the look on Shikamaru's face when Naruto copied him perfectly. They all laughed, and Naruto mentioned that Shikamaru is always a source of some kind of fun. Ino affirmed that he was amusing to watch, but not much fun to talk to. For nearly an hour after they finished eating, the Yamanakas and Naruto just sat around the table and talked. The conversation was as random as it was lighthearted, shifting from topic to topic with no real aim or direction. Hey Naruto, said Ino when things began to wind down, we've still got an hour and a half till you're supposed to be at that bridge. Do you want to go hang around town? Sure, Naruto said beaming. What did you have in mind? I was going to go and pick up some supplies for today's mission, starting with a bag or 2 of kunai, and I thought you might want to come with. Naruto hesitated for a minute. He stammered, I'm normally not welcome in most shops, and the owners tend to chase me out or throw things, so going into a store that sells sharp objects. Don't worry about a thing, said Ino, the shop I have in mind is owned by the sweetest old lady you'll ever meet. Well, okay, Naruto agreed. Good, said Ino, may we mother? Of course dear, just be safe, said Mrs. Yamanaka. Thanks, Ino declared as she got up, and motioned for Naruto to do the same. Together the 2 of them made their way out the door, after thanking Mrs. Yamanaka for breakfast and permission to go. The streets were strangely quiet for 8:30 a.m. in Konoha. Normally scores people would be up and bustling about by now, but Naruto and Ino walking side by side presented the most dense crowd in the street. The shopkeepers were all in their stores tending to whatever matters demanded their attention, or simply taking the time to enjoy the beautiful weather while business was so slow. The 2 genin walked down the main road to the quadrant of Konoha, holding a conversation about their respective sensei. Ino mentioned Asuma's relation to the Hokage, and Naruto joked about how Sarutobi must be nepotistic. They both got a laugh out of that, and another when Ino said she'd bet Kakashi was hiding beaver teeth under his mask. Ino stopped them in front of a small shop not far from the Ichiraku ramen stand. It was a little dark inside as racks of weapons blocked out most of the windows, but Ino didn't hesitate to lead Naruto inside. Momo, she called, it's Ino, are you here? There was a sound of falling metal objects crashing to the floor, and from within the jungle of shelves an old woman hobbled out. She was hunched over, garbed in a turquoise robe, and wore her startlingly white hair up in a bun. Her face was creased by countless wrinkles, but her sharp blue eyes were as clear as the Hokage's. Good morning child, she said in an aged voice, what brings you here? And you brought a guest, how wonderful. Momo, this is Naruto. Wonderful to meet you, child. My name is Amashi, said the old woman, an honor. Nice to meet you too, said Naruto, bowing slightly. Now, said Ino, what do you have in the way of shuriken and kunai? The old woman smiled, almost devilishly, and said, whatever you're looking for. How about something cheap? Asked Ino. Child, you should know price does not concern you. I can sell you whatever I want for whatever price I want. It's my store, and I happen to like you, so you don't need to worry yourself with things so inconsequential as price. And with that, the old woman motioned for them to follow her into the heart of the store, which turned out to be quite expansive. The building appeared to merely be a front, and the structure actually ran deep underground. She pointed out to them weapons of all kinds, spears that could be compressed into a cane, sturdy shields that would fold down into an object the size of a book but expand with the push of a button, armor made from the skin of a drake. All of it was absolutely fascinating. Where do you come by all this? Asked Naruto after she demonstrated a throwing star that was paper thin, but razor sharp and heavy as lead. The Hokage, she chuckled. I supply Anbu with all of their equipment, and Sarutobi-sama compensates me well for it. I take the money and use it to hire ninja who acquire everything you see here, be that from another village, or by making it themselves. I don't care. It's a good system. Obviously, thought Naruto. Ah, here we are, she said, stopping in front of a pegboard displaying dozens of kinds of throwing weapons. Just pick the kind you like and we'll call it a treat for my favorite, and only granddaughter. Thank you, Momo, said Ino, leaping at the woman and embracing her, while Naruto was taken back by the revelation. It's my pleasure, dear, now let go please, you're crushing me. Ino and Naruto skimmed over the display. Eventually Ino settled on a small, black shuriken with 4 blades at 90-degree angles. From one tip to the opposite it was about 3 inches and very thin. I'd like those, she said, pointing to her choice. The old woman opened up a small shelf beneath the board and pulled out a small burlap bag. A bag of 50 midnight screams. How about you, Naruto? She said. Naruto was still looking. He liked the midnight screams Ino had gotten, but was also entranced by the paper-thin shuriken and the firestorm kunai. What about that? He asked, pointing towards a kunai that had strange runes etched in the sides. Amashi grinned. Those are the frost cry, she said. They are made of a special kind of ice that, when treated properly, hardens into a metal that won't melt. They pierce the target, then the runes activate and shatter the kunai, sending hundreds of shards of super cold metal throughout the body of the enemy. Naruto cringed at the brutality, and elected to go with the midnight screams. Amashi tossed him a bag of 50 and asked if there was anything else they were looking for. Neither of the genin could think of anything, so the 3 of them made their way back to the front of the shop. Ino asked Amashi how the Ahira side of the family was faring, and the 2 of them began talking about family matters. Naruto was lost from the conversation, and having almost half an hour left before 10, decided to wander the shop. He looked through several racks of spears, and eventually made his way to the sword department. Nothing in particular caught his interest at first, but as he looked, he started to appreciate all the skill that must have gone into forging these. Amashi sold everything from katanas to claymores and everything in between. All of the swords were works of art, some with elegant finery etched into the handle or blade, while others were made of a metal that fluoresced different colors. An especially unique weapon caught his attention, a sheath, about 31 inches long, with a handle at either end. Not knowing if it was some kind of trick to confuse an enemy or not, Naruto reached out and took hold of the sheath in the center and picked it up. It was surprisingly light for its size, almost weightless, and he put his right hand on one of the identical handles, and drew out the blade. It was only 16 inches in length, making it a wakizashi. The blade was a burnished gold, and the edge was wickedly sharp. Naruto held it in front of his face, and looked it over. All in all, it was a magnificent looking weapon. Perfectly straight, no nicks in the blade, and a totally smooth finish. He sheathed it and tugged on the other handle, and another blade emerged. It was the same length as the other and just as sharp, but there the similarities stopped entirely. This time the blade was a deep and cold cerulean, with a serrated back, and a rough pattern resembling claws running down the sides. Wow! Muttered Naruto. Wow indeed, came an almost serpentine voice from the end of the aisle. Naruto turned and saw Amashi, standing there with Ino. The old woman looked startled, but at the same time intrigued. Did you have any trouble drawing those blades, son? No ma'am, why do you ask? He answered. Interesting, she uttered, do you know what those are? No, I don't actually. I mean, I know they're wakizashi, but I've never seen any this ornate before. He responded. Amashi chuckled, and walked up top him. She asked for the swords, and he gave them to her. The village of Mayu, she began, was destroyed long before I was born, but during their time they were famous for their mastery of forging. No one knows quite how they did it, but the smiths of Mayu were somehow able to imbue their works, especially swords and armor, with various enchantments using chakra and the very essence of themselves. Some swords could set things on fire, others would cut through any material, and others would be venomous by their very nature. Are those from Mayu? Asked Naruto and Ino in unison. Yes, they are. I went to great lengths to procure these, hoping they might open for me, but I was disappointed. Even so, I kept them, as a novelty mainly, but still hoping that they might open for someone from Anbu. What do you mean, open? Asked Naruto. So you want to learn about weapons of a past era? Asked Amashi. Both genin nodded. Amashi grinned. Well, I could spend a lifetime on the subject, but we don't have that kind of time unfortunately. Long story short, at the height of their skill, Mayu Smith were able to forge weapons they called sentients. These sword-like creatures were indeed made of metal, but they also had a very limited form of awareness. Now they couldn't speak or move on their own, but they could distinguish between people, and by unknown means, act. There was a brief pause. What do you mean act, Momo? Asked Ino. I mean, she said, now like a teacher at a lecture, that the swords would choose their owner, and act for them. I mean that only the owner could use the sword, or draw it, and the weapon's innate abilities would only work when the owner was using them. Don't get me wrong, they'll be a sword for anyone, but they'll only work to their fullest potential for you. Each was as unique as its wielder, making a set explanation impossible, but it looks like those swords just chose their master. Both Ino and Amashi looked at Naruto. Me? He asked after a second. Amashi nodded and held out the wakizashis. They'll only open for you now, she said, I have no more use for them. Naruto took them and bowed low, thanking her very much, then slung the sheath onto his back and fastened the strap so one handle was at his left hip and the other was at his right shoulder. They walked back up to the front, and Naruto and Ino again thanked Amashi for her generosity. It was my pleasure, really. And I am glad that those swords will finally be put to use. She said. I meant to ask, said Naruto, what did they do? Don't know, Amashi shrugged, that's for you to find out. Mayu swords grew in power with their owners, and mirrored them, so there's no telling what will happen, now you'd best go or you might be late. Naruto and Ino looked at the clock which read 9:50. You're right as usual, said Ino, hugging her grandmother, then turning and setting off towards home while Naruto made for the South Bridge. See you tonight, Naruto. She called over her shoulder. Later. He called back. SC. You're late, said Sakura as Naruto walked up to the bridge. By all of 30 seconds. Naruto responded. Sakura was sitting on top of the arch on the bridge's south side, and Sasuke leaned against the handrail. Naruto took a seat opposite Sasuke, and no one said a word. Naruto merely tried to avoid looking Sakura in the eye, and she made no attempt to make eye contact with him. It didn't take very long for the sound of the river beneath to become the only noise. What are those? Sasuke finally asked Naruto, breaking the silence. What, these? Countered Naruto, pointing a thumb to the swords. Sasuke nodded. Swords, what did they look like? Do you know how to use them? Naruto grinned, I plan to learn. Sasuke shrugged as there was a burst of smoke in the center of the bridge. Sorry I'm late, said Kakashi as he materialized in the cloud, but there was an old woman who needed help crossing the street and liar, shouted Sakura, pointing a finger at Kakashi. The copy nin put his hands up and grinned through his mask. Okay, relax, he said. When are we going to take this little survival test of yours? Asked Sasuke. Now, said Kakashi sternly, it's time we saw what you three can really do when your life is on the line. They were small, no larger than marbles. Two silver bells, suspended from strings wrapped around Kakashi's index finger, were swaying and jingling in the breeze that blew through the forest-surrounded plain a mile outside Konoha. These, said Kakashi shaking the bells, are your aim. The three genin stood in a line opposite the Junin, staring at the small shining orbs as he dangled them up in the air to display them. The whole extent of your test today is to take these from me at any cost. I don't care how you do it, but if you manage to get one, you pass and get to move on to be a true ninja. If you are unsuccessful and don't get one by noon, you fail. What do you mean, fail? Asked Sakura hesitantly. I mean, Kakashi said serpentinely, that you will be stripped of the title ninja, and made unable to ever attain it again. And let me tell you that no one has ever passed this test before. Kakashi took out an orange book and began reading a page roughly 1/3 of the way from the end. You can't do that, shouted Naruto. We worked hard to get this far. You can't just tell us it was all for nothing. Sasuke nodded. There are only 2 bells, meaning one of us is guaranteed to fail and never be a ninja. Naruto's right, you have no authority to say that. I do, and I just used it, chuckled Kakashi, not looking up from the book. You have exactly 90 minutes, I suggest you get. Sasuke wasted no time, and leapt at Kakashi like a lion. The raven-haired genin completed a series of hand seals inhumanly fast, and pressed 2 fingers to his lips. Kakashi dodged to the side, just as Sasuke blew an enormous fireball at the copy nin. Sasuke landed, pivoted, and whirled around to try and roundhouse kick Kakashi center mass. The Junin caught his foot and spun, throwing Sasuke face first into the dirt. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, shouted Naruto, suddenly creating a dozen clones of himself, each one with the 2 wakizashi drawn and ready to fight. Kakashi, though still off guard from the ferocity of Sasuke's attack, easily maintained his ground as the Narutos charged, and Sasuke staggered to his feet. The copy nin didn't even close his book, but fended off the Narutos by dodging and allowing them to hit each other, or by slamming his unoccupied hand into one's face, vanishing it immediately in a poof of smoke. Sasuke rejoined the fray, but was promptly picked up and used as a club by the Junin to annihilate the clones. Kakashi then threw Sasuke into Naruto, and sent them both tumbling in a heap. Within seconds of launching the attack, Kakashi stood over the 2 genin looking down at them, and condescendingly chuckling. Your teamwork desperately needs to improve, he said, but it was a valiant attempt. He just destroyed them both, fretted Sakura. How are we supposed to win against someone like him? Sasuke grimaced, and slammed his hand on the ground, smashing the small pellet he held, and creating a blinding cloud of smoke. Kakashi leapt back and all 3 genin took advantage of the cover and darted away in opposite directions. Sasuke retreated about 50 yards north to the cover of some underbrush, while Naruto went south to the forest itself and Sakura hid amongst some rocks to the west. Kakashi merely stood his ground in the middle of the field, and resumed reading his book, giggling with a pervert's delight from time to time. Naruto sat down to take a quick inventory of his gear, praying he had something that could distract the Junin long enough for him to steal a bell. 3 yards of steel wire, 50 shuriken, half a doze kunai, and 10 or so exploding tags. Enough for a trap worthy of a genin maybe, but he'd need more firepower to best Kakashi. I need the others' help, he admitted to himself. What? Naruto turned as a sudden explosion caught his attention. Sasuke had attacked Kakashi again, and thrown some small fire bombs around the Junin to hold him in place. Sasuke jumped over the wall of fire, and caught Kakashi's arm, throwing the man off balance, and causing him to drop the book. The two grappled for a moment before Kakashi twisted Sasuke's arm and threw him into the air. Sasuke rolled in mid-air and put his fingers to his lips again. Kakashi was still ringed in by the flames and could only watch as Sasuke shot another grand fireball down at him. The fireball moved closer and closer, and Kakashi put up an arm to shield himself. A genin shouldn't be able to do this, he yelled as Sasuke grinned. The Junin was completely enveloped by the flames. Sasuke's joy was short-lived, as there was a puff of smoke, and Kakashi was replaced by a smoldering log. Shit! Sasuke yelled as the copy nin appeared behind him. This time there was nothing Sasuke could do but watch as a heavy boot blotted out his vision, and drove him into the grass outside the flames. Sakura sat behind a rock, carefully watching the battle between Sasuke and the Junin, taking note of Kakashi's every move trying to find some flaw in his defense. It seemed to her that Kakashi was prone to underestimating what a genin could muster, but now that Sasuke had shown his hand, there was nothing he could to catch the copy nin off guard. And I don't have anything out of the ordinary I can do, which leaves Naruto, she thought, just as there was a slight rustle of grass beside her. The pink-haired girl whirled around, and flung a kunai. There was a metallic ring as it bounced harmlessly off Naruto's golden blade. Sakura, it's me, he hissed. What do you want? She whispered back. I've got a plan, he answered, holding up 2 makeshift shovels made of wood and several kunai, all lashed together with wire. How fast can you dig? SC. That should hold you, Kakashi said, stepping back and admiring his work. Sasuke hung from the branch of a tree, dangling a good 5 feet off the ground, suspended by and wrapped in steel wire. That worked well, thought Sasuke. 1 down, 2 to go, said Kakashi, and we're only 5 minutes in. SC. Are you sure this will work? Asked Sakura sheepishly. I mean we've only got 10 minutes left, so if this doesn't work, we're doomed. The hardest part, Naruto said, will be getting Kakashi-sensei to actually come this way. But once he does, it's over, and we'll be able to bargain for all 3 of us to pass. Great, thought Sakura, I guess, but how do we get Sasuke down? Naruto put his hands together, and created a cage bunshin, then crouched and marked the nearby boulder, behind which they were hiding from Kakashi with a small crest like that of an Uchiha. Leave that to me. Once Sasuke is down, we'll need to drive Kakashi here. You and the clone go left, said Naruto, I'll sneak around to the right, go now. He forcefully whispered. Sakura and the clone jumped up, and charged Kakashi, who readied himself for the attack by turning the page. Naruto quietly sprinted far to the right, and created another dozen clones directly in front of the one with Sakura. All the clones leapt at Kakashi, while Sakura unleashed a torrent of kunai and shuriken. Naruto crept ever closer, while Kakashi dodged and weaved between the deadly projectiles. Sometimes the copy nin would toss a clone in the way, subsequently nullifying both threats, so Naruto would stop and create another few clones to keep Kakashi busy, making it look like the original clone was the master. Sasuke, who had been watching carefully, turned to his left, and saw Naruto approaching. He immediately turned his attention back to the battle to keep from blowing cover. Finally Naruto was within striking distance, and flung himself at the tree, slicing through the wire with the swords, and landing gracefully behind. What? Asked Kakashi, stunned. Clones. Sasuke grabbed hold of the wire, and whipped it at Kakashi, who dodged to the side, as the lethal line snapped, and tore into the ground where he'd stood not a second before. Sasuke readjusted, and whipped the wire again and, as Kakashi was in midair and could do nothing to change course, snapped the Junin in the thigh. There was a loud crack, and Kakashi winced as a thin trail of blood fell from a rip in his leg to the ground. Sasuke! Shouted Naruto, nodding his head towards his and Sakura's previous hiding place. Sasuke's keen eyes caught the symbol immediately, and he knew something must be up. The Uchiha whipped the wire again and it lashed around Kakashi's other leg. Not today, said Kakashi, pulling out a kunai and slashing the taut wire, freeing himself and sending Sasuke reeling from the recoil. Naruto charged, and slashed at Kakashi with his left wakizashi, pouring all of his strength into the blow. The Junin blocked the blade, but jumped back as a blue spark leapt between the blades. It was apparently harmless, but Kakashi was unsure what to make of it. They're likely to be the conduit for some deadly jutsu, thought Kakashi. Naruto, not hesitating, angled himself opposite Kakashi and the trap, and charged again. This time Kakashi fought with both hands. He drew another kunai, and fended off all of Naruto's attacks, but couldn't find an effective opening to strike back that wouldn't be a fatal blow, so he didn't strike out for a real blow at all. The wakizashi were long enough that Naruto's wild movements put deadly force behind them, but short enough as to not make them as clumsy as a long sword. And what made it all the more difficult was that because of the shorter length, Naruto kept in close. Kakashi's long arms, even with the short kunai, had trouble maneuvering to match the awkward distance between himself and the genin, meaning that even an amateur like Naruto was a dangerous opponent. What gave Kakashi a definite edge, however, was that whatever gift the blades held, Naruto seemingly didn't know how to activate, and there was nothing more than a blue or golden flash every time the blades met. Enough games, said Kakashi, ducking under a blow and wheeling around, and planting his foot in Naruto's chest. The genin flew backwards, and rolled to a stop in the dust. Sasuke roared and jumped at Kakashi, taking the chance to attack, whereas before he would have been cut to bits. The copy nin was mere yards from the trap, and Sasuke held nothing back, blowing fireballs, lashing out with kunai, throwing firebombs, some to guide Kakashi, but most randomly to mask the purpose of the few aimed ones, and praying the Junin wouldn't notice Sakura letting out her last remaining lengths of wire. Naruto looked up from his place in the dust, then smirked and disappeared in a poof of smoke. The two wakizashi tumbled and stuck solidly in the ground. What? Kakashi gasped. The girl flung the line, which now had a shuriken lashed to either end at Kakashi. He jumped just in time to avoid the projectile. Naruto now! Bellowed Sasuke, and the blonde jumped from behind a rock, caught the line tearing open his hand in the process, and whipped it at Kakashi, who was again in midair. The line thrashed around Kakashi's leg, and the shuriken embedded in his calf, holding tight. Naruto jerked down, and Kakashi crashed through the camouflaged netting in front of the marked rock, and tumbled into a pit about 10 feet deep, 4 feet in diameter, and lined with no less than 20 explosive tags. The copy nin stood up and looked around, then reached up and started to adjust his forehead protector, but hesitated and rather put both hands at his sides. The three genin walked up and lined the edge of the pit, and looked down on the Junin. Do we pass? Asked Sakura haughtily. You still don't have either bell, said Kakashi coolly, and you have less than a minute to go. Naruto squatted down, holding out a small stick. Sasuke, if you would please, said Naruto. Sasuke grinned and blew a small stream of fire and lit the end of the stick on fire. We'll make you a deal, Kakashi-sensei, said the blonde. You let all three of us pass, and I won't blow you to straight to Suna. Kakashi looked around for a second, noting that the tags were very real, and ready to detonate at the slightest provocation. These kids are good, he thought, and not just smart, but brutal. I would never have seen this coming. Kakashi reached to his side, snapped the bells off his belt, and tossed them up to ground level. You pass, he said, all three of you. Thank you, said Naruto, catching the bells. He took one in each hand, and held one out to each of the other genin. How's that for endangering the mission? Sasuke and Sakura were completely silent and Sakura swallowed hard, but each took a bell out of Naruto's hands, then the three of them stood up, and took a step back. Kakashi jumped out of the pit, landing solidly in front of Sakura. Sasuke and Naruto gathered around at Kakashi's bidding, and he put a hand on the boy's shoulders. Well done, great job, he said, smiling through his mask. You pass with flying colors. Good teamwork, advanced individual skills. I was thoroughly impressed. The three genin smiled, even Sasuke grinned and looked down at the ground. How about we go to the beef bowl? Asked Kakashi, my treat. Sure, answered Sakura, while Sasuke nodded and said, why not? Naruto however shook his head, and declined. I actually had things I wanted to do today, he said, but thanks for the offer, I appreciate it. Alright, said Kakashi, but be at the Hokage's office tomorrow morning at 9. We're taking a group photo, and checking in to see if we've been assigned any missions. Right, said Naruto, turning and running back towards Konoha, grabbing and sheathing his wakizashi along the way. I'll see you all there. SC. Naruto arrived back at the Yamanakas at 10 till 1, and went in. Inside it was as warm and bright as always, with the scent of sweet flowers permeating the air. Anybody home? Naruto asked, closing the door behind him. In the kitchen, Mrs. Yamanaka called back. Naruto walked in, to find her sitting at the kitchen table, working with a small flower with an unopened purple bud. She was carefully examining the bud with a magnifying glass. What's that? He asked. She sat down the tool, and looked up at him, smiling as always. This, she began, is a flower I don't know the name of. I found it while I was wandering north of the river, and brought it home. There doesn't seem to be anything particularly special about it, but we can't tell for sure till it blooms. When will that be? He asked. I don't know, but it should be soon, given that the stock looks mature. How'd the test go? It was great. Naruto answered happily, and I'm glad you and Ino made me eat something. She chuckled. I thought you would be. Ino is in the garden if you wanted to tell her how it went. Naruto said thank you, and went to the mahogany door in the living room. He opened it and stepped into the new territory of the Yamanaka's indoor garden. It was rather small, not much larger than a normal house, but dense with all kinds of foliage that basked in the light let in by numerous windows and skylights. Ino sat in the middle with her back to him, tending the shoots of some orange and pink roses. He hopped over to her and she turned and smiled as he approached. Good afternoon, he said warmly. I thought you had a mission. I did, said Ino setting down her tools and standing up, but Asuma sensei said the situation suddenly got really bad and he had to cancel it. That's too bad, I'm sorry. Ino smiled. Don't be, she said, it's not really anything to complain about. But how did your test go? It was awesome. And I'm really glad I ate. Naruto laughed, and Ino giggled a little. I thought you would be, she said, echoing her mother. Hey Naruto stammered a bit, do you want to go get dinner later? Ino playfully cocked her head at him. I'd love to, she said. Dinner sounds great, but you choose the place. Would you like to help me out here in the meantime? Naruto beamed and eagerly accepted. Ino held out a small hand rake, and they knelt down by the roses, immediately lost in a conversation about flowers, herbs, and of course, ramen.